Good morning, everybody watching online. Yeah, so when we left off last time, we were in Genesis chapter 2, which we'll get back to in a moment. In fact, actually, we'll read this right now, and then I have a reference for you as to something we talked about. But Genesis 2:1 says, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished." And so this basically concludes the 7 days of creation, obviously, or the 6 days, I should say. Yeah. God's going to rest on the seventh. We know from just the literature here, the way that this is written, that Genesis 2 is a closer look at Genesis chapter 1, day 6, okay? It's not untypical for an author to do that. I mean, people even do that today. So, for example, you might be reading a biography of a historical figure, and they may give you an overview, for example, of a particular moment in a person's life, like, I don't know if it's like a military commander we're talking about or somebody, and then they may dive back in to something more specific, like, here's some information about Eisenhower, now let's talk about Eisenhower in the days leading up to D-Day, so we're going to back up a bit, okay? Give you a little more specifics. That's basically what this is. Now, this is not written as a biography, though. This is written as a historical narrative, and so that's important to take note of. So Moses has given us a narrative, but that narrative is going to focus in on day 6. Now, what we said, and we'll get to that in a second, but we said last week, and we've commented on this several times, like, how was Genesis compiled? How was it written? Moses wrote this thousands of years after Adam and Eve had already died. And so it's like, how did he get this information? What we understand about the writing is Moses is obviously compiling this with the hand of God, obviously, on him, but it's very clear that Moses is using sources that are not his. That means he's not just making this stuff up, okay? He's not doing this from like a hearsay. It seems as if he's reading off of a document, summarizing what those documents say, and then putting them into writing, okay? And these writings that he's reading, okay, that he's basing Genesis off of, we said were probably a series of what? What were they in the form of? Does anybody have any idea what these would be written? Stuff like possibly that. Scrolls or some type of early paper. Yeah, paper. Papyrus, but
I would think oral.
A lot of
passed down.
Some of it, possibly.
Well, back then, when they read out loud because not everybody had.
Yeah, from one generation to another.
Yeah, some of this, we suggested last week what's called the tablet theory of authorship. That there were certain documents, though. There probably were like oral traditions, but those oral traditions were based on a series of documents that were passed down. Right. Because of the way that this is written, right. It does seem that Moses is referencing materials. And it also seems that there are signatures written throughout Genesis as to like where these documents come from, which, of course, as Christians, we believe in miracles. So like the first document, as we're about to discuss, like we showed this last week too. So for those of you watching online who were here last week, there would be a little bit of overlap. But the first part of Genesis, I would suggest to you, was written and passed on by God. Okay, probably preserved by Adam. Amen. And then passed on down the line from Adam and onward. Now, is that inconceivable to think of that these documents would be passed down to Noah? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. In fact, by the time of Abraham, there was a great library in Ur of the Chaldees that had over 50,000 clay tablets. And so these tablets, we don't know exactly what these documents were. They were very, very old, though, and this library was eventually destroyed. But is it inconceivable to think that these documents were from before the flood? I don't think so. Not if you believe in a global flood, not if you believe in biblical history. I think it's more than plausible. And the other thing is, like, if you look at these societies, it's very clear that, like, Mesopotamia and Egypt, they preserved the knowledge that was existent before the flood. That's very obvious. Like, if you look from a secular timeline, it does not make any sense from an engineering perspective how these people created the things that they did this early on. So, for example, the pyramids. I don't think they were built by aliens. I think people had immense engineering knowledge that we don't have today. Clearly, we could not build something like that in such a short time frame. But I think that this knowledge was preserved from before the flood. I think that they had some retention of knowledge before the flood, from before the flood. So is it inconceivable to think that the people who preserve the knowledge to build remarkable structures that we can't build today would have saved documents from early on before the flood? No, I think saving the documents would be much easier than saving the engineering knowledge, in fact.
So what are your thoughts of people, the size of people being much larger than they are today, pre-flood?
I think that people in general, I don't know if this, there's two things I would say about that.
Yes.
I don't think scripture really says much about the average size of humans. I think we can turn to science on that, to like empirical data, because I think the Bible kind of allows us to look at it that way. Like, I think it would explain why Neanderthals possibly had different bone structure because they lived to a longer age. I think that you could look at their foreheads. That's the reason that possibly there was some issues with like their brow ridge being more like wider and things
Well,
like
the
that.
climate was different.
Climate definitely
all
different.
that, yeah, because it protects them from the sun's rays. Oh,
Yeah.
it's
Looking
Yeah.
at some of this stuff,
Permanent,
like,
yeah.
because you had said, you thrown out there,
Yeah.
the people were twice the size pre-flood of what we currently are, which would have allowed different building techniques, because they're bigger.
And some of those,
I don't know how much credibility to give that.
I would say, like what we find, I wouldn't say they were necessarily twice as big, but I would say there were some. And I think that those some were the Nephilim, which we'll get to who the Nephilim were.
Well, there was Goliath after that.
Yeah, but he was, I want to say about 6'6", which would have been a giant for those days. It's all relative speak,
right, right.
but yeah, if we're, now wait, Becky, what was the original? Because I was going to scroll, oh, that's right. I was like, wait, what was I going to scroll down to? I think some of the early humans who were big, and by the way, when I say early humans, I'm not saying this in the way that evolutionists do, like these were less evolved humans. But what I am saying is that I think it's evident that some early humans, like Neanderthals, like we call them Neanderthals, I mean scientists do, they're just early humans. I think that they weren't really much bigger than we are today. Cro-Magnons are about the same size. I think that a lot of Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals were actually pre-flood humans. Now some of these also, like Homo habilis and Homo erectus, are both humans. I believe they're humans, and they were around before the flood. They have different skull shapes a little bit, but I think that we could say that they're human. And again, I could be wrong on that. I could be wrong. Like, humans have all kinds of variations of skulls today, so it is ultimately, when you're looking at these fossils, it is kind of a guess and check because it's so long ago. But
So the Talmud states that he was 10 cubits high, which is roughly 15 feet. Now, I've not been able to
yeah,
find others other than just the Talmudic writings.
I kind of trust the Talmud a little
Okay.
bit. I don't know. I don't know, because I mean, I think Samuel gives a height for Goliath, and I can't remember what it was. I don't think it was quite in that scope. I'd have to look that up to see what exactly the height was for him, and if you can find
9
that.
foot 9 inches.
Was it 9
9
foot
foot
9?
nine.
I would say that, yeah, his height, yeah. I could believe that. I could believe that. Number-wise, I would say, I think that you could make the argument that some numbers are a bit of a hyperbole, depending on the writing. I don't think 9 feet that might not be a hyperbole. He might have just been a genetic, freak. Like, he is just a huge guy. The one thing I would say is this. Now, this is getting a bit off topic, but it is important to note that I don't think, especially if you look at archaeological record, but also just the language of Genesis, I don't know that humans were by and large that big before the flood, but I would say this. I do think some of the animals, some of the bugs were bigger. I think you could probably say that from scientific record. The other thing is there was these people who were around called the Nephilim, and they were these, it does get into a bit of a controversy, and I assume the same position as, and I say these people because that way you don't think I'm just throwing out crazy conspiracies here that nobody who's mainstream takes, but people like Ken Ham, people like Henry Morris, I believe in Genesis 6 when it says the sons of God saw the daughters of men. Pastor Harley and I both have talked about this and share similar positions. So I don't say this lightly, but I believe the sons of God were angels. I believe that Job does confirm that, and that these...
Yeah, that's one of the theories.
We don't know exactly how this worked, but they came down,
angels.
they took for themselves probably some kind of human form. They married women. There was probably forcible relations there with these women, and they produced these weird hybrid men called the Nephilim. And these Nephilim, I believe, were like superhuman. They were described as the heroes of old, and I believe people worship these things, and this is why God decided to flood the earth. And I also believe that this is where mythology comes from. If you look at a lot of, like the Mesopotamians believed in what's called the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki were these spirit beings that came down from the stars and showed them all this knowledge. The sons of God came down to the daughters of men. It all derives from Genesis 6. And so like the Mesopotamians weren't these just delusional people who were like, oh, let's just make up a story about the Anunnaki because we don't understand where rain comes from in storms. No, I think they knew. They had detailed maps of the planets. I mean, like, these people knew that there was nature. They knew where the rain and stuff came from. I think that they developed these stories to try to explain what had occurred before the Great Flood. And I think that there was obviously different versions of it that are not biblical, but that's where mythology comes from, I believe. And I think it's the best explanation for it.
I think that what you're talking about and everything like that, Satan's extremely smart, and so he's trying to mess things up. And so when you say that angels come down like that and stuff like that, okay, so be it. That's just Satan trying to get a whole, messing things up as far as creation
genealogy.
and all that stuff. So yeah.
So,
it just,
now the question is, why though? Why would he do that? Like, why would he use that as an attack on mankind? To send the sons of
Because he
God?
wants to usurp God's creation.
I would say there's a very specific reason why.
Yeah, it's about worshiping. It's about taking the place of God.
He wanted to be equal. He wanted to take the place of God, but there was something mentioned in Genesis that terrified Satan. And he knew that there was something out there.
Christ coming.
The seed.
The Messiah.
He knew the seed was prophesied to crush his head. And he knew it would be the seed of the woman. And so he said to himself, I can become God. I can ascend to above the stars of God. And how I'm going to do this is I'm going to destroy the prophecy before it even takes place by contaminating the human line. And that's why when God found Noah, of course, Noah had not been a participant or a descendant of any of those things. But also, this is why, people gathered together at Babel. They built that tower and they started building pyramids, probably in the likeness of Babel, to recreate that which was before the flood. They wanted this global society. Nimrod, you could look, it doesn't say this specifically, but I do believe the text implies that Nimrod was a heroic hunter. They looked to him just the way the people looked to the Nephilim before the flood. And this is why God said, listen, you can't stay together. I gave you the command to fill the earth, and you haven't done it. And you look at the arrogance of people at Babel. They say, let's see how high we can build this tower. Let's see to what knowledge. And it says that God came down and looked at the tower. That's where he dispersed their languages, of course. So it all comes back to pride. But pride originates with Satan, of course, thinking he could usurp God, the one who created him. Problem is, he was never more glorious than the one who created them. He had all these jewels, and as we read in Exodus, I think it's like 36, 37, I always get the two chapters mixed up, talks about him being arrayed with gems and stuff. He was only arrayed with those things to cover the throne of God, to reflect God's glory. It was never his glory. It was always God's glory that he was reflecting.
Absolutely.
But he saw the glory of God that he was meant to reflect off of that throne, and became arrogant and was like, well, it's me, I'm the one. And that led obviously to the rebellion, and you have the fall of man in Genesis 3. So it is all connected. But I would say that, back to the Goliath thing, I would say that he is not a descendant of the Nephilim. That is a very important thing to take note of, because the Nephilim were destroyed. All humans, there were no human survivors other than the family of Noah. But the knowledge of that was still retained. If you remember, were all of Noah's sons like faithful? No, some of those guys were heathens. I mean, like Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem is considered to be the righteous one. Ham is considered to be the one who was not righteous for sure. I mean, there were some bad things that happened there, and so we could speculate on some things with Ham. But the thing with that is, not all of these guys were believers necessarily. So they took the knowledge that they knew before the flood, and they kept it, and they were the ones who probably helped to propagate this mythology. Because it's kind of weird, like when you look back at the record, it's like Mesopotamian mythology and building just comes out of nowhere. It's just on the map. There's not like a gradual process. It's just they start building pyramids. They believe in the Anunnaki, all these weird creatures. Where the heck did that come from? And it's like the Bible offers an answer,
The process of smelting metals and stuff also, it's like, where'd that come from?
Yeah.
I've tried to discover how they used to do it. Everything I come up with comes out with chemicals, and that it's like that ain't what they did.
Yeah, well, they discovered that very early on, and you do have to question like where do these building techniques come from? They found things that are even older than the pyramids. A place in Turkey, in fact, which, by the way, would have been right after the flood. We think that the Noah's Ark might have landed somewhere around Turkey. We don't know for certain. Heck, they might have even found it. But I don't put any weight on that. But what did they find? They found a site called Göbekli Tepe, which is like one of the oldest archaeological sites in the world, and I do believe is pre-flood. Even secular scientists acknowledge that there was a flood in that area, and that this thing was probably around before the flood. It's got markings. We don't know what they mean. It's very, very old. But these huge monolithic stone structures, how could people have moved that stuff that early on? And the thing is, the Bible offers an excellent explanation for that the world had achieved this level of knowledge that was extremely advanced because they had lived these long lives. You think of like someone as smart as Einstein. What if he had lived 800 years? What are some of the things he would have discovered? And the population of the earth would have been as big as it is now. It would have been in the billions. If you look at, the genealogies and all that, there's a lot of young Earth creationists do believe the population would have been in the billions. And so you would have had people who were as smart as Einstein, presumably, living these hundreds and hundreds of years, because they were saying, Einstein was kind of on the brink of discovering things like relativity, and if he had lived that long, he could have worked with someone like Stephen Hawking and figured out quantum gravity and how they work together and stuff. Well, the thing is, they didn't live that long. But if they did, imagine the kind of discoveries we'd have now. That's what they had before the flood. And so I think this knowledge was definitely passed on, and I think there's evidence of that. There's just it's so strange. Like, Egypt is such a strange example. Like, where did they learn how to build these things? Like the Sphinx, for example, is carved out of rock. It's not like things piled together. They literally carved that out. The Olmecs use stone tools to smash into giant boulders and create these perfectly sculpted heads with smooth features and stuff. It's like, how do you do that? And how do you do that in such a short amount of time? We couldn't do it today. There was, back in the 2000s, they tried to build an obelisk, okay? An Egyptian obelisk. It's like it looks like the Washington Monument, okay? And they tried to build one that was like 1/10 of the size of those in the New Kingdom, and it collapsed. They couldn't figure out how to build it. It was crazy. And using modern engineering techniques, they couldn't do it. So it tells us a lot. It really does. But one thing I want to point out here, when it says Okay, so we already read this. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God created and made. And by the way, this is interesting that it uses the phrase created and made, because created was the creating from nothing, and then some of that was taking the materials that he used and kind of shaping them into stars and stuff. It's not saying he didn't, just because he didn't create the stars out of nothing. He did create them out of nothing, but he created the material out of nothing and then shaped them together as he saw fit. That's why, there's the potter and clay analogy, of course, with God being the creator. It says, this is the history of the heavens and the earth, and heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord made the earth and the heavens. Okay, so as we said last week, this refers back. Everything from Genesis 1:1 to 2:4, and the word history here is the Hebrew word toledoth, okay? Now that word, I would click on it to find the number, but I'm afraid we may have to reconnect to the internet, so I'm not going to do that. You may have to use a concordance to find that, your Strong's concordance. But this is a signature. As I said last week, all throughout the book of Genesis, you find this, that's not where I wanted to go, sorry. You find this phrase called toledoth. And in every other case, last week we read Genesis 5:1. It says, this is the book of Adam. So I would argue to you that everything from Genesis 2:5 to 5:1 is a document written by Adam directly. And there are all these signatures throughout Genesis. And I think that these signatures are marked by that word for a specific reason. They tell you who wrote each part. Now the question is, who wrote Genesis 1:1 to 2:4? Because the signature does not list a name. It's the only one that doesn't list a name. And I would argue that it's God. Because God is mentioned directly in this verse in context of creation.
Amen.
And the other thing is, who could have possibly wrote? Adam wasn't around when the earth was created. He wasn't around until day 6. And so God had to have given this knowledge to Adam, who would have then preserved it. But Adam does not put his name on this stamp because he didn't write it. It was given to him by God.
Amen.
And so Henry Morris, if you look at ICR.org, Institute for Creation Research, and again, I can't say I necessarily agree with all of the positions that they take on young earth creationism, but they do have a lot of interesting theories. Now, if you go to that website and you type in the word toledoth, that is TOLEDOTH, you'll find a host of information. Okay, so if you just go up to the little magnifying glass here, search. These are some of his Bible notes, but let me read this really quick here. It says, the King James. Becky, does King James say generations, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, some say genealogy, some say history, some say generations. And in fact, I actually like the term generations probably better. I think the King James does get a good translation on that. He likes the King James as well, Henry Morris. This is actually in his study Bible, if you ever get that. It's a good study Bible. It says, generations, which is the Hebrew for toledoth. For people online, this is kind of small writing, sorry, is the word from which the book of Genesis gets its name. That's also an important thing that we really actually didn't say. In the Septuagint, it is rendered by the Greek Genesis, which in Matthew 1:1 is translated generation. Okay, so it says here, this is the first occurrence of the formula which marks the key subdivisions of this book. These are the generations of. Now, he gives all the references here. So, in fact, I can figure this out. Let me zoom in here. So for people online, okay, that might be a little bit too zoomed in. For people online, hopefully you can see that there. But if you want to look up those references, those are all the signatures. Now, I'm going to make the argument that if you read the first chapter of Exodus, I think the first chapter of Exodus also gives a signature. Henry Morris does as well in his study Bible, but he doesn't list it here. So if you look at Exodus 1, I don't know the verse off the top of my head, admittedly, and I'll get you to read it. That's the final signature. And I would say that indicates that it was handed on to Moses from that point. So I think you can actually trace, if you ever order something on Amazon, you can kind of trace where it's coming from. That's kind of what the purpose of this is. So that when we go around today, it's yes, oral tradition was a thing, and it was very accurate within Jewish culture. So some of this might have been corroborated by oral history. But I do believe Moses is actually basing this on documents, though, which is important. So you actually have two things. You have oral history and you have documents, both working together and getting us Genesis. And the other thing is, as I said, Egypt had a close relationship with Mesopotamia. So it's not unlikely to think that Moses, being a prince of Egypt, would have access to all of this stuff. He was around during New Kingdom Egypt as well. So New Kingdom Egypt was extremely powerful. They had extent clear up into what we would say would be like Iran. They had trade networks that went extremely far. So Moses definitely would have had access to documents, okay? So from a historian's perspective, I don't see any conflict there. But I'm going to read this for people online who may not be able to see it. It says, in all except the first one, the name of a specific patriarch is attached, okay? And that's kind of what we said. He just words it a little better than me. Parallels with the terminology of the ancient Babylonian tablets indicate that these names are actually the signatures of the original writers of the particular tablets. So they're not just pulling this theory out of thin air and saying, well, wonder if these are tablets. Henry Morris, to come to this conclusion, and a lot of other historians who come to this conclusion, they look at the precedent of the day and how were other documents written in this culture. They did the same thing. They give you who wrote this portion of a tablet. And so that's basically what he's saying there. This is like in Babylonian, Egyptian times, this is how they did it. That is, each of these primeval patriarchs kept the narrative records of his own generations, inscribing them on stone or clay tablets, and then appending his name at the end when he was ready to turn over the tablets and the task of writing the Toledolf to the next line. Okay? And eventually some of these, by the way, that Moses accessed might have been written on scrolls. That's very possible. But it says, they eventually came down into Moses' possession, who wrote the last section of Genesis, 37:3, obtaining the information from the sons of Jacob in Exodus 1:1. So it was Exodus 1:1. As well as organizing and editing all the rest under divine inspiration.
There you go.
Notice that. Organizing and editing, okay?
Yeah.
Is it unheard of for someone to take documents that are really old, organize and edit them? No. I'm taking a class on the Declaration of Independence. That's what Thomas Jefferson did. Thomas Jefferson, a lot of what he wrote wasn't his own writing. He got it from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, George Mason. He got a lot of it from John Locke. He took those documents, put them together, kind of wrote them in his own words, and you get the Declaration of Independence. And then Ben Franklin comes in and actually edits it. He changes some of the wording to be his wording. And so it doesn't make the book of Genesis like a less special thing. In fact, it actually makes it more special to suggest that like divine intervention brought all these sources together. So that gives you the reference there. So I want to read I rarely just read off the slide, but this is too good not to. It says here, so the entire collection finally became, in effect, the first of the 5 books of Moses. Since the first tablet, Genesis 1:1 to 2:4a, what we just read, that's what we've studied so far, tells of events prior to the existence of any witness to record them, God himself either wrote this section directly or specifically revealed it to Adam. It describes the generations of no person, therefore, but rather those of the cosmos itself. Okay? So it's interesting. All the other ones say this is the generations of Adam. This is the generations of the heavens and the earth, which could only be transcribed by God himself. And so I love the way Henry Morris says this. Now, if you go down here, I mean, I'd love to keep reading, but he lists many, many good footnotes on this. So if you type in Toledoth here, let me zoom back out. You'll get so many references here because there's more pages than this, believe it or not. This is just one reference. But he gives you a footnote for most of these references. Like if you want to read about the one in Genesis 10, Genesis 25, generations of Esau, like different uses of the word generations, he will give you those. Like here, Genesis 5:1, which is the next one, written by Adam. He gives you a whole footnote. If you go to this, he gives you all these references. And then the other thing is, look at this. They also give you interesting articles that relate. So like oldest ancestor is evolution, fake science, all these different things. So I like the Creation Institute, the reason Institute for Creation Research. I like them because they hire and employ real scientists. Like some of the scientists they employ, like Jeffrey Tompkins, these guys have PhDs from places like Clemson. They're not like a bunch of scrubs academically. I would argue that a lot of these guys have just been blackballed from the scientific community because they hold views that scientific community doesn't want to agree with, okay?
Happens a lot.
And you know what? It's funny because it's not even just young Earth creationists who are being kind of sent out from these scientific communities. There's people who suggest maybe the pyramids are older than 4,000 or 5,000 BC. Maybe the pyramids have some evidence that they're, a couple thousand years older, even the Sphinx. Those people are like blacklisted from the scientific and historical community because they don't want to rewrite their timelines. They get paid to publish certain things, and when they get paid to publish, they'll stand by those things no matter what. And so they'll never believe the Bible because it goes against their funding and other things like that.
That's part of the ultimate deceiver too.
It is. Money's, to some degree, the root of all evil there. Mike, yeah.
Yeah, 2 Peter 1:20 says this, knowing this verse, that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation, for prophecy never came by the will of man, but by holy men of God spoke as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. So back in New Testament, God did this whole thing.
Yeah.
So we're talking that way, okay? And good stuff, man.
I mean, if you believe in miracles, it's very plausible that this stuff is handed down. And you look at atheism, they believe in miracles as well. They believe the universe spontaneously came into existence out of nothing. Inorganic materials somehow came alive, which violates the law of biogenesis. They believe that we happen to get here through all these freak accidents that are absolutely implausible. They try to suggest that there's infinite number of universes to try to explain it, but there's absolutely zero evidence for that. That's also another miracle they believe in. And so I would argue to you, it's like they want to point fingers and say, well, you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and you believe the Bible is authoritative. Yeah, well, you believe something came from nothing. And absolute nothing uncaused, which is a violation of every principle of science and reasoning that we understand today.
Yeah.
So don't point the finger at us. They always say, well, the burden of proof is on Christians. No, that's not true. When you state something as a fact, you have a burden of proof. And that means if you state the belief that God does not exist as a definitive statement, you have a burden of proof to prove that. You can't just get off by saying, well, there's no evidence for God. That's not an argument against God, though. Okay? That's not a positive argument against God. You can't get away with doing that.
They're pointing a finger.
If you're an atheist and you're going to pretend to be an academic, you owe positive evidence. You can't just give negative evidence against God and be like, well, that's happened. You have to give positive evidence to affirm your worldview. If you don't, you're nothing more than an agnostic. So I would argue there's no real thing as an atheist. There's really just agnostics.
They're just pointing a finger at God. That's all. They're just.
And even some of the greatest scientists and thinkers, they wouldn't even accept atheism because they knew it led to some really preposterous things. They're like deists or whatever, which is still a false religion, but they still acknowledge the existence of some kind of creator because you just can't get around it.
There's a chart I wish I could find. It's the life of how long like Adam lived, and then who was actually in the world, why he was still alive. A lot of the knowledge was also by basically family passing. I mean, they knew each other. They read it to each other.
Yeah, there was knowledge that was definitely
it's not
handed
really
down.
hard to figure out how that knowledge was kept. I mean,
sure.
Especially with the hand of God on it. But
Yeah, absolutely.
When you realize, when you look at this chart and you see, oh wow, this person was alive. Wow, this person was alive. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it's good stuff. Yeah, we got some really heavy stuff here. Now,
I wish I could find that.
when we get back,
Heavy stuff.
I knew that this was, to quote Marty McFly from what is that? Back to the Future.
Yeah.
Man, this is heavy. We need Dr. Emmett Brown in here,
I
too.
love it. That's good. That's
If
good.
Emmett Brown was around for real, I'm sure he'd be a young Earth creationist. So we'll get ready to close in prayer here. But yeah, we'll get back to the
That's
specifics of the creation of man.
I like it. That's heavy.
marriage, gender, all that stuff coming up here. So it's going to get more heavy. Sorry, I'll close in prayer here. Dear Heavenly